Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to sleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching? Be comfortable and relax. The Boarding House Mystery. The old boarding house stood at the edge of town, shadowed by a dense canopy of gnarled trees that seemed to lean inward, as though sharing a secret. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, a relic of a bygone era. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would choose to stay, but for those like Emily, desperate and running low on funds, it was a refuge. At least, that's what she thought when she first arrived. Room 203 was sparse but clean, its single window facing the imposing trees outside. Across the hall was room 204. It was locked, and from what Mrs. Abernathy, the sharp-eyed landlady, had told her, it had been for years. "Not in use," the old woman had said curtly, her tone brooking no further questions. Emily didn't think much of it at first. She spent her days looking for work and her nights staring at the cracked ceiling, counting the hours until the sun rose again. But by her third night, the peculiarities began. It started with a faint sound, so soft she wasn't sure if it was real or just her imagination. A whisper, muffled, indistinct, like a conversation through a thick wall. Emily dismissed it as one of the older tenants talking in their sleep. But then came the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, starting at one end of the hall and stopping just outside her door. She would hold her breath, waiting for the knock that never came. One night, summoning her courage, she peeked through the peephole, expecting to see a neighbor pacing restlessly. But the hall was empty, illuminated by the dim, flickering bulb in its center. By the end of the first week, the sounds grew more persistent. The whispers were louder, though she still couldn't make out the words. The footsteps returned, accompanied by a dragging noise, as if something heavy were being hauled along the wooden floor. And then came the scratching. The first time she heard it, she froze in her bed, her body rigid with fear. It was faint at first, a gentle scrape against the floorboards, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from room 204. Emily told herself it was rats, or perhaps an old pipe groaning under the weight of the building's age. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too calculated. It would start in short bursts, a few scratches at a time, before stopping, as though whatever was making it was listening, waiting for her reaction. One night, the whispers turned into a low murmur, rising and falling like the tide. It sounded closer, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of room 204's door was standing just behind it. Emily pressed her ear to her own door, trying to make sense of the noise. That's when she heard it. Her name, Emily. It was barely audible, but there was no mistaking it. She staggered back, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every groan of the old building felt like it was coming for her. By the end of the second week, her nerves were frayed. She confronted Mrs. Abernathy, demanding to know what was behind the door. The landlady's reaction was unnerving. Her face paled, and her lips tightened into a thin line. "Stay away from that room," was all she said before shuffling away, her cane tapping against the warped floorboards. But Emily couldn't. The whispers, the footsteps, the scratching, they were consuming her thoughts. She started leaving her room late at night, pacing the hall, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was tormenting her. One night, she noticed something she hadn't before. Faint marks on the floorboards outside room 204. Scratches, long, jagged lines, as though something with claws had been dragged to or from the door. The door itself was unremarkable, painted the same dull beige as the rest of the hall. But the air around it felt different, heavier, colder. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the doorknob. It was icy, as though it had been sitting in a freezer. A sudden burst of laughter erupted from behind the door, high-pitched and childlike. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet. That night, she dreamed of room 204. In her dream, the door was wide open, revealing an endless void. From within came a shadowy figure, its form shifting and writhing as though it were made of smoke. It reached out for her, its elongated fingers stretching impossibly far. She woke with a scream, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. Emily knew she had to leave, but something kept her tethered to the boarding house. It wasn't just the cheap rent or her dwindling savings. It was the door. Room 204 had ensnared her, and she couldn't escape its pull. By the third week, Emily made a decision. She would find out what was behind the door. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread she couldn't shake, she waited until the house was silent. The other tenants were asleep, and even Mrs. Abernathy's snores were absent. Standing in front of room 204, she took a deep breath and reached for the doorknob. This time, it turned. Emily's world unraveled piece by piece, and her grasp on reality slipped further with each passing night. The boarding house, once merely a decrepit refuge, had become a labyrinth of noise, shadows, and memories she couldn't trust. It started subtly. On the 12th night, after a fitful sleep broken by whispers that seemed to echo her own name, Emily woke to find her room bathed in moonlight. The single window framed the blackened trees outside, their branches tapping against the glass like skeletal fingers. But it wasn't the branches that caught her attention. It was the reflection. She saw herself standing in the room. Only her reflection wasn't sitting on the bed as she was. The figure was standing, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her lips moving silently. The moment their eyes met, the reflection's lips stretched into a slow, malevolent smile. Emily blinked, and it was gone. But the sensation of being watched lingered. The next morning, she tried to dismiss the experience as the result of poor sleep, but her body betrayed her. Her hands shook as she reached for her coffee, and dark shadows loomed under her eyes. As the steam curled from the cup, her mind drifted to her mother's face, thin, pale, and frightened. "Keep the door locked, Emily. No matter what you hear, no matter who calls." Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a fragmented memory she had buried deep. Her childhood home had been filled with locked doors. Some led to rooms they never used. Others, she was told, weren't safe to enter. The strongest memory came back to her unbidden. The door at the end of the hall in her childhood house. It was locked every night without fail. Emily remembered waking one night to the sound of it opening. Her mother had screamed, a sound that still haunted her. By the end of the second week, Emily felt the boarding house itself breathing around her. The creak of the floorboards under her feet seemed deliberate, as though the house anticipated her movements. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, but when she turned to confront them, there was nothing. The noises from room 204 intensified. It was no longer just whispers and scratching. It was laughter now, a child's laughter, high-pitched and echoing, as though multiple voices blended into one. One evening, Emily sat on her bed with her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the door to her room. The faint, rhythmic tapping sound was back, emanating from room 204. But this time, it wasn't just behind the door. It was all around her, as though the walls themselves pulsed with the sound. Closing her eyes, she pressed her palms to her ears to block it out. When she opened them again, she wasn't in her room anymore. She was standing in a hallway, but it wasn't the boarding house. The walls were yellowed with age, peeling in long strips, and the air smelled of mildew and faintly of blood. It was her childhood home. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, and at the very end stood her mother. She was turned away, her head hanging low. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Her mother didn't respond, but the sound of her breathing filled the space, ragged and shallow. Slowly, she turned her head, and Emily froze. Her mother's face was wrong. Her features twisted into an expression of agony, her eyes sunken and dark. "Why didn't you keep it locked, Emily?" her mother hissed. Emily screamed, and in an instant, she was back in room 203, her body drenched in sweat. The door to her room stood wide open. Emily couldn't tell if what she'd experienced was a nightmare, a hallucination, or something worse. She barely left her room during the day, spending her time pacing or sitting with her back pressed against the wall, her eyes glued to the door of room 204. Memories of her childhood came flooding back in disjointed pieces. She remembered the arguments between her parents, her mother's whispered warnings, and the locked doors in their house. But one memory stood out above the rest. She was 8 years old, sitting on the stairs as her mother and father argued in the living room. The shouting was louder than usual, and Emily couldn't help but creep closer to listen. "Don't open that door," her mother screamed. "You know what will happen if you do." Her father's response was a growl, his voice low and menacing. "You think a lock can stop it? It's already here in her." Her? Who had they been talking about? Emily's head throbbed as the memory faded, leaving her feeling hollow and afraid. By the third week, Emily's mind was fractured beyond repair. She no longer trusted the shadows, the reflections, or even her own thoughts. Room 204 was the epicenter of it all, and she was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. One night, she heard her name again. "Emily." The voice was soft, pleading, but this time, it didn't come from behind the door. It came from her room. She spun around and saw the child again. The little girl with her own face, sitting cross-legged on the bed. "You let it out," the girl said, her voice hollow. "Now you have to put it back." Before Emily could respond, the girl's form disintegrated, her body dissolving into black smoke that swirled around the room. The smoke coalesced at the door to room 204, seeping into the cracks like ink into paper. The door creaked. Emily pushed the door open, her breath caught in her throat as it creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the empty hallway like a warning. The dim bulb above flickered, casting wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and crawl along the walls. Room 204 loomed before her, its darkened interior a stark contrast to the pale light spilling from the hall. For a moment, she hesitated. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn back. But her body moved forward as if pulled by invisible strings. The air was heavy and cold, carrying with it a damp, metallic smell. "Hello?" Emily's voice trembled as it broke the silence. The room was empty, or so it seemed. It was smaller than her own, with walls coated in peeling wallpaper and a thick layer of dust blanketing every surface. The only piece of furniture was an old, decrepit chair sitting in the middle of the room, its legs splayed unevenly like a creature ready to pounce. But it wasn't the chair that made her stomach drop. It was the scratches. They were everywhere. Long, jagged gouges crisscrossed the walls, floor, and even the ceiling, as though something with claws had torn through the room in a frenzy. The marks were deep, revealing the dark wood beneath the wallpaper and leaving splinters scattered across the floor. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Emily spun around, grabbing at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the door with her fists. But the only response was a low, guttural whisper. "Emily." It came from everywhere at once, above her, beneath her, around her. The voice wasn't her mother's, or the child's, or her own. It was something else entirely, ancient, hollow, and brimming with malice. The temperature plummeted, and Emily's breath came out in white puffs. The shadows in the room thickened, pooling in the corners and creeping toward her like living things. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. That's when she saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a vague outline in the dark. But as her eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body unnaturally thin and contorted. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in sharp, claw-like tips that scraped the floor as it moved. The figure stood in the corner, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching her with glowing, hollow eyes. Emily staggered backward, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with an oppressive weight. "You let it out." The words echoed in her head, the same ones the child on her bed had said. Suddenly, memories surged forward, piecing themselves together like a puzzle she had been too afraid to solve. She saw her childhood home again, her mother frantically locking the door at the end of the hall. She saw her father, drunk and angry, pounding on the same door. "You think a lock can stop it?" he had bellowed. "It's already here, in her." The memory shifted, and Emily saw herself as a child, standing in the doorway of her parents' bedroom. Her mother was crying, her father yelling, and between them stood the figure. The same twisted thing now watching her from the corner of room 204. "No," Emily whispered, clutching her head. "No, it's not real. It's not real." But it was real. It had always been real. The figure moved then, its elongated limbs creaking like old wood as it stepped closer. The sound of its claws scraping against the floor sent shivers down Emily's spine. She stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall. "Stay away!" she screamed, but her voice was barely a whisper. The figure didn't stop. It loomed over her now, its glowing eyes burning into hers. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with images, memories flooding her mind in rapid succession. She saw herself as a child, standing in front of the locked door, her small hand resting on the knob. Her mother's voice was frantic, begging her not to open it, but curiosity had gotten the better of her. She turned the knob, just a crack, and then darkness. The memory faded, and Emily was back in room 204, the figure inches away from her. Its voice filled her head again, cold and emotionless. "You brought me here." Emily's breath hitched. The realization hit her like a blow. This thing had followed her. It had been with her since that day, hidden in the shadows of her life, feeding on her fear, her guilt, her pain. "What do you want?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The figure leaned closer, its face, or what passed for a face, mere inches from hers. Its voice was a raspy whisper. "To go back." The words sent a chill through Emily. She didn't understand what it meant, but she knew she had no choice but to act. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might help her. That's when she noticed the scratches again. This time, they formed a pattern, a strange, circular symbol carved into the floor around the chair. The figure turned its head, following her gaze. Its claws twitched, and for the first time, Emily thought she saw something human in its movements. Hesitation, perhaps even fear. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a deafening hum. The shadows closed in, and the air seemed to vibrate with energy. Emily felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it. The answer lay in the symbol, the chair, the room itself. Her hands trembling, she stepped forward, toward the chair, toward the symbol. The figure roared, a sound that shook the very walls, and lunged for her. Emily lunged toward the chair at the center of the room. The scratches surrounding it, intricate and deliberate, formed a strange symbol she couldn't comprehend but instinctively felt was important. The air grew denser with each passing second, pressing down on her chest like an unseen weight. The figure loomed closer, its claw-like fingers twitching, its presence suffocating. "Let me go," she whispered, barely able to force the words out. The figure stopped, its glowing, hollow eyes fixed on her with an intensity that froze her blood. For the first time, Emily felt that it was waiting, expecting something from her. But what? The chair seemed to hum faintly, its surface cracked and splintered from age, yet somehow pulsating with energy. The whispers around her grew louder, a chorus of voices she couldn't distinguish. Her mother's voice, the child's voice, her own voice, distorted and layered. "You let it out?" Emily's mind reeled as fragments of her life pieced themselves together like shards of a broken mirror. The boarding house hallway twisted into her childhood home again, the yellowed walls bending and stretching around her. She saw herself as a child, standing before a locked door with her hand hovering over the knob. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't open it, Emily, no matter what you hear." But Emily had opened it. The memory rushed back in full force now, vivid and horrifying. She saw the door creak open just an inch, and in that instant, something slipped through. A shadow, formless and cold, seeping into the room and, somehow, into her. Her mother's screams filled the air. Her father's voice bellowed in rage. "You brought it into this world, Emily." The vision shattered, and Emily found herself back in room 204, trembling in the dark. The scratches on the floor glowed faintly now, the lines of the symbol pulsating like veins. The figure took a step closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as though its body resisted its own movements. Its eyes bore into her, and she felt a strange sensation, regret, pain, a longing that wasn't her own. Emily's heart raced. The whispers filled her ears, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. She clutched her head, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want from me?" she screamed. The figure tilted its head, the movement eerily slow and deliberate. Its raspy voice echoed in her mind. To go back? Emily staggered backward, her heel catching on the edge of the glowing symbol. Her gaze darted to the chair at the center, then back to the figure. The scratches on the wall seemed to shift, the lines forming shapes, faces, expressions of fear, anguish, and emptiness. "Go back where?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. The figure raised a clawed hand and pointed at her. The realization hit her like a blow. This thing, whatever it was, had been tethered to her since she was a child. She was its door, its anchor, the only thing keeping it from returning to wherever it had come from. But how could she send it back? Could she undo what had been done? Emily stepped into the center of the symbol, her body trembling as the figure drew closer. The whispers around her softened, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the chair. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing the backrest. Suddenly, the shadows surged forward, enveloping her in darkness. The figure's claws wrapped around her wrist, icy and unyielding. "Let me go!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the void. For a brief moment, she felt herself falling, weightless and suspended in nothingness. Then came the memories again. Her mother's face, her father's anger, the locked doors of her childhood home, and finally, the door at the end of the hall. It was there, waiting for her, closed, but no longer locked. When Emily opened her eyes, she was no longer in room 204. She stood in the boarding house hallway, the dim bulb above flickering as it always had. Her heart raced as she looked around, disoriented and confused. Room 204's door was shut tight, as though it had never been opened. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Her breath caught in her throat when she glanced down at her hands. They were covered in dust and faint scratches, her fingernails broken and bloodied. Her gaze shifted to the floor beneath her, where the faint outline of the glowing symbol remained, etched into the wood. From behind room 204, the whispers began again. "Emily." But this time, they weren't pleading. They were laughing. Emily staggered back, her knees buckling. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the lights dimming one by one. As she stumbled toward her own room, the door to room 204 creaked open, just a sliver. She didn't dare look back. She locked her door and slid to the floor, her back pressed against the cold wood. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, and through the chaos, one thought pierced her mind like a dagger. The door wasn't just in the boarding house. It was in her. It always had been. The laughter from room 204 echoed in her ears as the lights went out, leaving her in total darkness. The haunted mansion. The mansion was a towering relic of another era, perched on a cliff overlooking the restless sea. Its once grand facade was now cloaked in ivy, its windows shattered like broken eyes, and its front doors creaked on rusted hinges when the wind swept through. For decades, it had loomed over the small coastal town, a haunting reminder of a tragedy no one dared to discuss. For Clara, the mansion wasn't just an abandoned house. It was a challenge. As an amateur historian and aspiring novelist, she couldn't resist its allure. It was the perfect setting for her book, and perhaps the answers to the rumors surrounding it could give her story the authenticity it needed. But as Clara crossed the threshold into the mansion's shadowed halls, she realized this was more than a story. Something lived here still, in the walls, in the air. Something waiting to be uncovered. The townsfolk had told her little, their faces pale and wary at the mere mention of the place. Some said the mansion belonged to the Caverly family, once the wealthiest in the region, their fortune built on shipping and trade. Others whispered of strange disappearances, servants, guests, even family members, who were never seen again after entering the house. "Cursed," one old woman had muttered, her voice barely audible over the din of the cafe. "That house eats people." Clara dismissed the superstition. Ghosts weren't real, she told herself. But standing in the grand foyer, with its sweeping staircase and peeling wallpaper, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The first night in the mansion was uneventful, though unsettling. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes, and the air was thick with dust and decay. Clara set up her sleeping bag in the library, its towering shelves still crammed with books. As she sifted through the volumes, she stumbled upon something extraordinary. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle with age. The name on the first page made her heart race. Margaret Caverly, 1887. The entries began innocuously enough. Notes about the weather, the state of the estate, and letters exchanged with her husband, Arthur. But as Clara read further, the tone grew darker. June 14, 1887. Arthur has been spending more time in the study. He says he is working on something important, something that will change our lives forever. But he won't tell me what it is. The servants whisper behind my back, and I've caught them crossing themselves when they think I'm not looking. June 23, 1887. Strange things are happening. I hear footsteps at night, but when I rise to check, no one is there. Arthur insists it's the wind, but I know the sound of footsteps. June 30th, 1887. I found Arthur in the study, speaking to someone, though when I entered, he was alone. He seemed startled, even angry that I had interrupted him. There was a book on the desk, its pages filled with symbols I could not understand. He snatched it away before I could look closer. The last entry Clara read sent a chill down her spine. July 15th, 1887. I fear I am losing my mind. Last night, I saw a figure at the foot of my bed. It was tall, shrouded in darkness, with eyes like burning coals. It did not move, but I felt its gaze pierce through me. Arthur says it was a dream, but I know it was real. Clara set the journal down, her fingers trembling. She had read enough ghost stories to recognize the signs. A descent into madness, fueled by something sinister. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. That night, Clara dreamed. Or at least, she thought she dreamed. She was in the mansion again, but it was alive, vibrant. The peeling wallpaper was replaced with ornate patterns, and the air smelled of flowers and candle wax. She saw Margaret, standing at the window in a flowing white gown, her face pale and drawn. Behind her stood a man Clara recognized as Arthur from a portrait she'd seen in the library. He was holding the book Margaret had described in her journal, his lips moving silently as his fingers traced the symbols on its pages. The air around them shimmered, darkening like a storm cloud. Margaret turned to Clara then, her eyes wide with terror. "Run," she whispered, "before it takes you too." Clara woke with a start, her heart pounding. The library was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through a cracked window. But she wasn't alone. In the corner of the room stood a figure, tall and shrouded in shadows. Its eyes burned like embers, just as Margaret had described. Clara blinked, and it was gone. The next day, Clara delved deeper into the mansion's secrets. The study, where Arthur had spent so much of his time, was locked. It took hours of searching to find the key, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom. Inside, she found the desk Margaret had described, its surface littered with papers and an open book filled with strange, arcane symbols. As she flipped through its pages, she felt a strange pull, as though the book wanted her to read it, to understand it. But she couldn't. The symbols seemed to shift on the page, and the air around her grew colder the longer she stared. A faint whisper tickled her ear. Margaret's voice. "It's watching." Clara spun around, but the study was empty. She shoved the book into her bag and fled the room, her footsteps echoing through the silent halls. Clara tried to convince herself that the strange events of the first few days were simply the product of her imagination. The mansion was old, its creaks and groans easily explained by time and neglect. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. After reading Margaret Caverly's journal and experiencing her own unsettling vision, Clara felt an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The mansion seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its shadows growing darker, its silence heavier. And the presence, it wasn't just watching her. It was moving closer. The first undeniable sign came late one night as Clara sat in the library, poring over the strange symbols from Arthur's book. She hadn't dared to read the journal again since the whispers in the study, but the book seemed to call to her, its pages radiating a sinister energy. As her eyes scanned the symbols, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath puffed out in pale clouds, and frost began to form on the edges of the window. The overhead chandelier swayed, its chains creaking in the sudden cold. Then the furniture began to move. It started with the chair opposite her, scraping across the floor as though someone had risen from it. She froze, her heart hammering, as the chair continued to inch closer to her, its legs groaning against the wooden boards. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The answer was a soft, guttural laugh, low and inhuman. The following night, Clara awoke to the feeling of fingers brushing her arm. She bolted upright, clutching at the flashlight she kept beside her sleeping bag. The room was empty, but her skin tingled where she'd felt the touch, as though the sensation lingered. Her flashlight beam swept across the library, illuminating the rows of dusty books. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a figure slipping between the shelves. But when she turned, there was nothing there. She sat up for hours, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the house. The shadows seemed to stretch and contract, shifting unnaturally with every flicker of moonlight. When she finally lay back down, she felt it again, a cold, invisible hand resting on her shoulder. This time, she didn't sleep. The walls come alive. By the end of the week, the house was no longer subtle in its torment. It was as though it had grown tired of hiding. The walls of the library began to hum faintly, a low vibration that Clara could feel in her bones. One afternoon, as she sifted through papers in the study, the humming grew louder. She placed her hands on the desk to steady herself, and the wood beneath her palms seemed to ripple, as though the desk itself were alive. The sound escalated into a deep, resonant groan, and suddenly, the walls began to bulge inward. Clara stumbled back as the wallpaper split, revealing dark, gaping cracks that oozed a thick, black liquid. The room felt smaller, the air pressing down on her, choking her. A voice whispered in her ear, Margaret's voice. "It's in the walls." Clara ran, her footsteps echoing through the house as the whispers followed her. Desperate for answers, Clara found herself in one of the mansion's upstairs bedrooms, a place she had avoided until now. The room was empty save for a large, ornate mirror mounted on the far wall. Its surface was clouded with dust, but as Clara approached, it began to clear, as though something on the other side was wiping it clean. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. The figure in the mirror was pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes. Its lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed behind her. Clara spun around, but the room was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, her reflection was normal again. But the words "Get out" were scrawled across the glass in frost. The presence grew bolder with each passing day. Clara began to notice shapes in her peripheral vision, dark, humanoid figures that disappeared the moment she turned to look at them. One evening, as she sat in the library, the air grew heavy, and a shadow stretched across the wall in front of her. It moved independently of the flickering light, growing larger and more defined. She watched in horror as the shadow took on the form of a man, tall and thin, with impossibly long arms that ended in claw-like fingers. It seemed to stare at her, though it had no face, and as it moved closer, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Leave," it rasped, the word echoing in her mind rather than her ears. Clara scrambled to her feet, knocking over her chair in the process. The shadow dissolved into the floor, but the air remained oppressive, filled with a silence so heavy it felt alive. Clara's breaking point came when she discovered a second journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the study. This one belonged to Arthur. The entries were chaotic, written in a shaky hand, and filled with ramblings about unlocking the veil and summoning the eternal. He spoke of an entity he had called forth from beyond, a creature that promised him power but demanded a price he hadn't anticipated. "I thought I could control it," Arthur had written. but it is stronger than I imagined. It feeds on us, our fear, our pain. It has taken Margaret, and now it wants me. The final entry sent a chill down Clara's spine. The house is its vessel, the walls, its body. If you are reading this, it already knows you're here. The journal slipped from Clara's hands as the room plunged into darkness. The air grew colder than ever, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. She fumbled for her flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark, but it flickered and died almost immediately. A low growl filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards. Clara's pulse raced as the shadows in the corners began to converge, forming a single, towering figure. Its glowing eyes burned through the darkness, locking onto hers. "You shouldn't have come," it growled. Clara ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get out. The house seemed to fight her, doors slamming shut before she could reach them, furniture sliding into her path. The whispers turned to screams, and the walls themselves seemed to close in around her. When she finally reached the front door, it refused to open. She pounded on it, her fists bruising against the unyielding wood. Behind her, the figure drew closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate. As she turned to face it, the world around her went black. As Clara sank into the void, it enveloped her, not in cold or terror, but in something oddly familiar, almost comforting. She felt weightless, floating in an endless expanse. The whispers that had tormented her before softened, taking on a rhythmic, almost melodic quality. It was as though the house itself was speaking to her. When Clara awoke, she was lying on the cold floor of the library. The first thing she noticed was the silence, the oppressive, all-encompassing stillness that seemed to stretch beyond the physical space. And then, a voice. "Why are you here?" It wasn't like the guttural growls or chilling whispers she'd heard before. This voice was soft, measured, almost curious. Clara turned toward the source, her heart pounding. In the corner of the room stood the shadowy figure, no longer looming or hostile, but still unsettling in its unnatural stillness. Its glowing eyes watched her, and though it had no discernible features, she could feel its attention fixed entirely on her. Clara struggled to speak. "I came to learn about this place, to understand." The figure tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate. "You want the truth?" "Yes," she whispered. The room seemed to shiver, the shadows rippling like water. Clara's mind filled with images, not memories, but impressions. She saw the mansion as it once was, vibrant, alive, filled with laughter and light. And then she saw its decline, the walls darkening, the air thickening, as though the house itself had rotted from the inside. "It was him," the voice said, its tone tinged with something Clara couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or sadness. "Arthur." Over the next several days, the encounters with the entity became less terrifying and more deliberate. The figure no longer appeared as a looming shadow, but as a presence that seemed to ebb and flow with the house's energy. Clara began to feel it everywhere. In the creak of the floorboards, the flicker of the chandelier, the cool drafts that brushed against her skin. At times, it spoke to her directly, its words fragmented but growing clearer with each encounter. "He called me," it said one night, its voice low and resonant. "He thought he could control me." "Why did he call you?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. The air grew colder, and for a moment, the room felt impossibly vast, as though the walls had receded into infinity. "He was afraid, weak. He wanted power, to bind me to this place. But he failed." Clara's mind raced. The journal entries made sense now. Arthur's obsession with the symbols, the book in the study, the whispers of a ritual gone wrong. But there was something the entity wasn't saying, a truth it was holding back. "What are you?" she finally asked. The figure appeared then, emerging from the shadows with a fluid grace. It was less monstrous than before, its shape more human, though its eyes still burned with an unnatural light. "I am what remains," it said cryptically, "of him, of her, of this place." The more time Clara spent in the mansion, the more she began to sense the entity's presence as something familiar. It wasn't just a haunting. It was as though the house itself was alive, its walls breathing, its floors groaning under the weight of memories too heavy to bear. One night, as Clara sat in the library, the journal in her lap, she felt the entity's presence settle beside her. She couldn't see it, but she knew it was there. "You're not here to hurt me," she said, more a statement than a question. "No," it replied. "Then what do you want?" The room seemed to exhale, the faint hum of the walls growing louder. For a moment, Clara thought the entity wouldn't answer. But then it spoke, its voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Release." Clara frowned, her fingers tightening around the journal. "You mean to be free of this place?" The air grew colder, the chandelier swaying slightly above her. "Not just me. All of us. All of you." Clara's voice wavered. "Who else?" The shadows around her began to shift, and suddenly, she wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the darkness, dozens of them. Some were faint, almost transparent, their features blurred as though time had worn them away. Others were more defined. A maid in a tattered uniform, a man in a bowler hat, a young girl clutching a ragged doll. Margaret was among them, her face pale and lined with sorrow. She stepped forward, her gaze locking onto Clara's. "It's the house," Margaret said, her voice heavy with regret. "It binds us. It keeps us here." Clara's heart pounded as she looked at the figures. "Why me? Why show me this?" Margaret glanced at the shadowy figure, her expression unreadable. "Because you can end it." The shadow stepped forward then, towering over the other figures. Its burning eyes fixed on Clara, and for the first time, she didn't feel fear. Only a strange, aching sadness. "I am what he made me," it said, "what he could not contain. I am the house, its pain, its hunger." Clara's breath hitched. The pieces began to fall into place. Arthur's ritual hadn't just summoned the entity. It had fused it with the mansion itself, binding it and everyone inside to this cursed place. "But if I free you," Clara said slowly, "what happens to the house? To you?" The entity's form wavered, its edges dissolving into the shadows. "The house will fall, and I will cease." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Clara felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Was it pity? Grief? The entity wasn't just a monster. It was a victim, trapped in the ruins of a man's ambition. Clara stood in the center of the library, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the shadowy presence of the entity. She thought of Margaret, of the lives lost to the house's hunger. She thought of Arthur's journals, his desperate, doomed attempt to control something far beyond his understanding. And she thought of herself, an outsider drawn into a web of darkness, now faced with a choice she didn't know how to make. "Will you help us?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. The entity didn't speak, but Clara felt its gaze, its weight, its silent plea. I don't know," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. The house groaned, the walls shuddering as though the mansion itself was waiting for her answer. Clara stood frozen in the center of the library, the weight of the mansion pressing down on her like a vice. Around her, the faint figures of the trapped souls flickered, their eyes hollow and pleading. Margaret stood closest, her frail voice barely audible. "You can end this, Clara. You can free us." But then the entity's voice cut through the stillness, low and resonant. "There is no freedom, only balance. Destroy the house, and the pain scatters, but it remains." Clara's head swam with the weight of the choice before her. She had seen the truth. The mansion was not just a prison for the souls trapped within. It was a vessel for the entity's power, for the darkness Arthur had summoned and failed to control. And now it was her burden to bear. "You don't have to fight," the entity said, its shadowy form shifting and twisting, moving closer. "Stay. Accept the balance. I'll protect you." Clara flinched at its words, but she couldn't ignore the pull she felt, the connection that had formed between them. It wasn't love, nor friendship, but something deeper. A shared understanding of loneliness, of being bound to something neither of them had chosen. Margaret's voice broke through her thoughts. "It's lying to you," she said, her tone sharp. "It doesn't want balance. It wants you." You're the key to keeping this house alive. Clara turned toward Margaret, the words slicing through her resolve. Was it true? The entity had spared her when it could have destroyed her, but was that mercy or manipulation? The figures around her began to wail, their forms flickering like dying flames. The air grew heavy, the room spinning as the house itself seemed to pulse with desperation. Clara's hand drifted to the journal on the floor, its pages open to Arthur's final entry. I failed. The house is alive. If it cannot be controlled, it must be destroyed. But the cost? Her gaze shifted to the entity, its burning eyes watching her intently. What happens if I destroy it? She asked, her voice trembling. The house will fall, the entity replied, its voice steady, and so will everything within it. Me, them, you. The figures around her cried out in protest, their voices a cacophony of anguish. Margaret stepped forward, her expression resolute. Let it fall, Clara. Don't let it keep hurting people. End it. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears as she looked between Margaret and the entity. The shadows twisted and surged, the house groaning as if it were alive, waiting for her to decide. I don't want to die, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The entity extended a shadowy hand toward her. Then don't. Stay. We can keep the balance together. Clara hesitated for a long moment, then slowly reached out. Her hand trembled as it met the entity's shadowy fingers, a coldness like nothing she'd ever felt spreading through her veins. The house exhaled, the tension in the air easing as the figures around her began to fade. Margaret's face crumpled in despair. You've made a mistake, she said, her voice distant as her form dissolved into the air. Clara's connection to the house deepened immediately. She could feel it breathing, its walls pulsing like a living organism. The entity's voice filled her mind, no longer distant but intertwined with her thoughts. You belong to me now, it said, not as a threat but as a statement of fact. She felt the weight of the souls still trapped within, their cries dulled but ever present. She understood now. She wasn't just a guest in the house. She was part of it. Months later, the townsfolk noticed small but strange changes around the mansion. The ivy that had choked its walls began to wither. The windows that had once been shattered gleamed clean and whole. Some swore they saw lights flickering in the windows at night, though no one dared approach. Clara rarely left the house. She no longer needed to. The entity was always with her, speaking to her in whispers that only she could hear. Together, they managed the house, ensuring the balance it so desperately craved. But the cost was high. On nights when the wind howled and the shadows crept longer than they should, Clara could still hear the faint cries of those trapped within. She saw Margaret's face in her dreams, her silent accusations haunting her. And sometimes, when she stood at the mansion's highest window, staring out at the restless sea, she thought about the life she'd left behind. But the house would never let her go, and deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. The secret library in the farmhouse. The farmhouse had always been an oddity in the family, a place no one talked about, but everyone seemed to know. Clara remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell in hushed tones. That house isn't just old, child, she'd said once, her wrinkled hands trembling around a cup of tea. It remembers things it shouldn't. When Clara inherited the farmhouse after her uncle's sudden and unexplained disappearance, she'd thought little of it. It was a remote, decaying relic tucked away in the hills, far from her life in the city. But curiosity tugged at her, a need to understand the place that had been hidden in whispers and secrets for generations. She arrived at the farmhouse on a crisp autumn morning, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth. The house loomed before her, its faded exterior betraying years of neglect. But it was the inside that captured her attention. The library, concealed behind a false wall in the study. The discovery of the library was both accidental and inevitable. Clara had been inspecting the study, idly tracing her fingers along the wooden panels, when one of them shifted under her touch. Behind it was a narrow passage, and at the end, a heavy oak door adorned with intricate carvings. Pushing it open, she stepped into a room unlike any other. The library was dimly lit by a skylight covered in thick grime, casting long, distorted shadows over rows of shelves. The air smelled of aged paper and something else, something faintly metallic. The books, bound in cracked leather and dark cloth, bore no titles. Clara reached for the nearest one, its cover embossed with a sigil that looked both ancient and alien. As she opened it, her stomach tightened. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, words written in a language she didn't recognize. At first, she thought the texts were meaningless, but as she turned the pages, certain patterns emerged. Diagrams of circles, constellations, and intricate rituals seemed to align. Among the books, Clara found a journal tucked away at the back of a shelf. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Her uncle's. October 3rd, 1995. The library isn't a collection, it's a warning. These books weren't meant to be read, but to be kept hidden, to protect us, to protect the world. October 10th, 1995. I made a mistake. I read the first ritual aloud, thinking it was harmless. The animals have been restless ever since. They don't come near the house anymore, not even the birds. I hear something in the walls at night. October 25th, 1995. It's too late. I tried to undo it, but the symbols in the book don't make sense anymore. The library, it's alive. I think it knows me. The journal ended abruptly, the last entry smeared with ink or, perhaps, something darker. That night, Clara dreamt of the library. She saw herself standing in its center, the books rearranging themselves on the shelves, their pages turning as though guided by an unseen hand. The sigil on the first book she'd opened glowed faintly, and she heard a voice, low, guttural, and speaking in the language she couldn't understand. She woke in a cold sweat, the whispering from her dream lingering in the back of her mind. It wasn't until she entered the library again that she realized the sigil from her dream had burned itself into the wooden floor, faint but unmistakable. As she traced the mark with her fingers, the room grew colder. One of the books fell from the shelves, landing with a dull thud at her feet. The title, faintly etched into the leather, was now legible: Ritualis Umbri, The Rituals of Shadows. Clara dove deeper into the books, deciphering what she could from the diagrams and fragmented Latin phrases. The text spoke of rituals meant to commune with the in-between, a place beyond time and space where shadows gained form. The farmhouse, she learned, had been built on land tied to these rituals. Her ancestors had discovered it centuries ago, a thin place where the veil between worlds was weakest. The library was their safeguard, a way to lock away the knowledge they had uncovered. But it wasn't enough. The rituals had a cost. Every generation paid it, through sickness, madness, or worse. In the margins of one book, scrawled in an unsteady hand, were the words, "It feeds on us." As the days passed, Clara began to feel the farmhouse's influence creeping into her mind. The whispers grew louder, no longer confined to the library. Shadows moved in her peripheral vision, darting just out of reach. One evening, as she sat in the study, she felt a sudden chill. The room darkened, though the sun hadn't yet set, and the air seemed to hum with energy. "You're here," a voice said, soft and low. Clara spun around, but the room was empty. The voice came again, this time from inside her own head. "You've read the books. You've seen the truth. What do you want?" Clara asked, her voice shaking, to finish what was started. The voice wasn't just speaking to her. It was in her, filling her thoughts with images of the rituals she'd read about. The sigils, the diagrams, the incantations. They weren't just instructions. They were a map. Unable to resist, Clara followed the voice's guidance, arranging the books and drawing the sigils on the library floor with charcoal. Her hands moved of their own accord, tracing lines and symbols she hadn't consciously remembered. The air grew heavy, the shadows in the room deepening until they seemed solid. The books on the shelves trembled, their pages fluttering as though caught in an invisible wind. As she spoke the words aloud, the voice in her head grew louder, blending with the sound of her own until she couldn't tell them apart. The sigil on the floor began to glow, the faint light growing brighter until it filled the room. Clara felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, and for a moment, she thought she saw figures in the shadows. Tall, distorted shapes with glowing eyes, watching her. "You've done well," the voice said, a hint of satisfaction in its tone. "It's time to open the door." The ritual ended as abruptly as it had begun. The light from the sigil faded, leaving the room in darkness. The air was still, but Clara could feel the change. The farmhouse wasn't just alive now, it was awake. As she stepped out of the library, she heard the faint creak of floorboards above her. Shadows moved across the walls, though there was no light to cast them. In the distance, she heard her uncle's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Clara, what have you done?" The farmhouse groaned, its very structure seeming to shift around her. She realized then that she hadn't unlocked a door but had become part of one. The knowledge she had unearthed could never be forgotten, and the family's curse was now hers to bear. As she stepped outside, the farmhouse loomed behind her, darker and more foreboding than ever. It would always call her back, and she knew she would answer. The farmhouse had no shortage of mirrors, though Clara hadn't noticed them at first. They were old and tarnished, their frames ornate but cracked, their glass clouded as if stained by time. One hung above the mantel in the study, another in the upstairs bedroom, and a third stood as a full-length piece in the library itself, hidden behind a curtain of dust and cobwebs. Clara first paid attention to the mirrors after her initial encounter with the ritual. She had returned to the library the following day, the sigil faint but still etched into the floor, and noticed that the mirror in the corner was no longer as clouded as before. It gleamed faintly, its surface rippling as if catching light from a hidden source. When Clara stepped closer, she saw herself, her reflection perfectly clear, yet something was wrong. At first, she couldn't pinpoint the unease. The woman in the mirror had her face, her clothes, her stance, but as Clara leaned in closer, her reflection tilted its head ever so slightly, not in response to her movement, but independently, as though it were studying her. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection didn't respond. Instead, its lips curled into a faint smile, a smile Clara was certain she wasn't wearing. Her heart pounded as she stepped back, her breath quickening. The smile on the reflection's face grew wider, its edges stretching unnaturally, and for a brief moment, Clara swore she saw something moving behind her in the glass. When she turned to look, the library was empty. But when she faced the mirror again, her reflection had returned to normal. The mirrors began to play a larger role as the days passed. They didn't merely reflect the room. They showed glimpses of something else, another version of the farmhouse that pulsed with darkness. In the study, the mirror above the mantel revealed faint figures flitting through the reflection, shapes that weren't in the room but moved with purpose in the glass. They were blurry at first, but as Clara watched, they became clearer. Men and women in old-fashioned clothing, their faces blank and featureless. One evening, as she stood before the upstairs bedroom mirror, she noticed that her reflection was holding something she wasn't, a leather-bound book. Its cover bore the same sigil as the one on the library floor. "What do you want me to see?" Clara murmured, her voice barely audible. Her reflection tilted its head in the same unsettling way it had in the library. Then, without warning, the glass surface rippled like water, and the reflection raised the book toward her. A faint, guttural whisper filled the room, the words impossible to understand. Before she could react, the mirror shattered, the shards flying outward and narrowly missing her. Clara stumbled back, her heart racing, but when she looked down, the shards didn't reflect the room. Instead, they showed the same sigil glowing faintly in each fragment. The most disturbing moment came 2 nights later in the library. Clara had been avoiding the mirrors, keeping her focus on the books and trying to decipher their secrets. But as she worked, she felt the weight of a presence behind her, watching, waiting. Slowly, she turned toward the mirror in the corner. Its surface was no longer clouded but eerily pristine, its clarity unnerving. Her reflection stood just as it should, mimicking her posture, her expression. But then, it moved. Clara froze as the reflection stepped forward, its movements smooth and deliberate. It placed its hand on the inside of the glass, And though she didn't move, she felt a cold pressure against her own palm, as though the reflection were pressing against her. "Don't turn away," the reflection said, its voice soft but unmistakably her own. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. "You don't know what you've done," it continued, its tone laced with both warning and pity. "You've let it out, and it won't stop now. It never stops." "What do you mean?" Clara whispered, her voice cracking. The reflection's eyes darkened, its pupils expanding until they consumed its entire gaze. "It's hungry," it said simply, "and it's coming for you." The mirrors grew more active after that night. They began to reflect scenes that weren't happening in the room but felt chillingly real. Margaret standing in the library, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her uncle in the study, pacing frantically as the house seemed to close in around him. One morning, as Clara approached the full-length mirror in the upstairs hall, she saw the entire room and its reflection coated in blood. It dripped from the walls, pooled on the floor, and ran in rivulets down the glass. But when she turned to look behind her, the room was as it had always been, dusty and untouched. The whispers in the mirrors grew louder, blending with the voice that now lived in her head. It urged her to return to the library, to finish the ritual she'd started. "You have to finish it," the reflection said one night, its hand pressed against the glass, "or it will take you too." Clara pieced together the significance of the mirrors from the books she studied. They weren't ordinary reflections. They were windows, portals to the in-between that the farmhouse bridged. The mirrors didn't just show what was real. They showed what wanted to be real. Her family, she realized, had used the mirrors as part of the rituals, binding themselves to the house and its power. But with every ritual, the line between the two realities blurred further, until the mirrors became a way for the in-between to seep into their world. In her uncle's journal, she found a chilling entry. The mirrors show what the books cannot. They reveal the house's hunger, its pain. But beware, they reflect more than just the house. They reflect you. Clara now avoided the mirrors at all costs, but they seemed determined to draw her attention. Their whispers followed her through the house, their surfaces gleaming even in the darkest corners. On her final night in the farmhouse, she found herself once again in the library, the air heavy with the weight of the house's energy. The full-length mirror stood in the corner, its surface impossibly clear. When Clara looked into it, she didn't see herself. She saw the shadowy figure from the ritual, its burning eyes staring back at her. "Finish it," it rasped, its voice a low growl. "Or stay with me forever." The glass rippled, and for a moment, Clara saw herself on the other side, trapped in the dark, pounding against the glass. Her reflection smiled, and then the mirror shattered, plunging the room into silence. The farmhouse had grown eerily quiet. The usual creaks and groans of the old structure had ceased, leaving an unsettling stillness that followed Clara like a shadow. She avoided the mirrors as best as she could, but they seemed to find her regardless. The reflections no longer merely mirrored her. They revealed fragments of something far darker, glimpses of a truth she wasn't ready to face. In the library, the full-length mirror had shifted again, its tarnished glass now pristine. Its surface glistened as though alive, faint ripples distorting her image whenever she walked by. Tonight, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Clara stood before the mirror, her heart pounding. Her reflection stared back, perfectly still, yet something about it was off. The room in the mirror seemed darker, the bookshelves twisted at odd angles. And then her reflection moved, independently, tilting its head as if studying her. "You've seen me before," the reflection said, its voice her own, yet colder, detached. Clara froze, her pulse racing. "Who are you?" Her reflection stepped forward, closer to the glass, its eyes locking onto hers. "I am you," it said simply, "or I will be." "No," Clara whispered, stepping back. "You're lying." The reflection smiled, a slow, chilling grin that didn't reach its eyes. "You've already begun. The ritual, the sigils, the books. You called me here." "I didn't mean to," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. But now you do." the reflection replied. "And you can't stop it." The glass of the mirror rippled violently, and Clara felt an invisible force pulling at her. Her feet slid across the floor as though the mirror itself had become a vortex, dragging her into its depths. She clawed at the edges of the frame, her fingers slipping against the cold, smooth surface. The reflection inside stepped closer, its burning eyes filled with something between malice and triumph. "Don't fight it," the reflection said, its voice echoing in Clara's mind. "This is where you belong." With a final, desperate pull, Clara was yanked through the mirror. When Clara opened her eyes, she was no longer in the library. The world around her was twisted and wrong. The bookshelves were impossibly tall, their spines glowing faintly with symbols she didn't recognize. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic tang of blood and decay. The sigil from the library floor glowed beneath her feet, its light pulsating like a heartbeat. The walls of the room seemed to breathe, their surfaces shifting and writhing as though alive. Then the figure appeared. It stepped out from the shadows, its form even more grotesque than she had imagined. Its limbs were long and jagged, its head tilted unnaturally, and its burning eyes fixed on her with an intensity that froze her in place. "You've crossed the threshold," it said, its voice a low growl. "Now you see. What do you want from me?" Clara asked, her voice trembling but defiant. The figure's lips curled into a sinister grin. "I want what you've always had to give. I want your name, your shadow, your place." Clara stumbled back, her breath shallow. The figure raised a clawed hand, and the air around her shimmered. Images flashed before her eyes, memories that weren't hers, yet felt deeply familiar. She saw herself as a child, standing in the doorway of the farmhouse, her grandmother whispering warnings she couldn't yet understand. "Never look too long in the mirrors," her grandmother had said. "They don't just reflect, they take." The memories shifted. She saw her uncle in the study, pacing frantically, his face pale and drawn. His voice echoed in her mind. "The books, the mirrors, they're all connected. They don't show you what's real. They show you what the house wants." Then she saw herself again, her hand pressed against the mirror's surface. But the reflection wasn't hers. It was the figure's, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly light. "No," Clara whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't me." The figure stepped closer, towering over her. "It will be," it said, "unless you stop it." Clara's mind raced. The books had warned of this, the sigils hinting at a cycle that bound the family to the house, to the mirrors, to the shadows. She wasn't just a visitor here. She was part of it. But she couldn't give in. Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara turned to face the figure, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "If you're a reflection of me, then you can't exist without me. And if I end this, you end too." The figure hesitated, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. For the first time, Clara saw uncertainty in its eyes. "You don't understand," it said, its voice quieter now. "We're bound. If you destroy me, you destroy yourself." Clara knelt, tracing the glowing sigil beneath her feet. The words of the ritual came to her unbidden, rising from a place deep within her mind. She began to speak them aloud, the language foreign yet strangely familiar. The figure roared, lunging for her, but the sigil flared with a blinding light, forcing it back. When the light faded, Clara found herself back in the library. The mirror was shattered, its shards scattered across the floor. The room was eerily quiet, the oppressive weight of the farmhouse momentarily lifted. But something was wrong. Clara glanced at one of the larger shards of glass and froze. Her reflection stared back at her, but its eyes burned with the same ember-like glow as the figure's. "No," she whispered, backing away. The reflection smiled, its lips curling into a cruel grin. "It's too late," it said. "You didn't destroy me. You became me." Clara clutched at her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The farmhouse groaned around her, its walls seeming to shift and close in. She could feel the weight of its presence in her mind, its whispers now a constant hum in her thoughts. She hadn't escaped the figure. She had only ensured that it would live on, through her. Clara remained in the farmhouse, her connection to it growing stronger with each passing day. The mirrors no longer reflected her as she was, but as the entity she had become. The books continued to whisper their secrets, their pages filled with rituals she now understood all too well. The farmhouse was awake, and so was she. As the sun set over the hills, Clara stood before the shattered mirror, her burning eyes glowing in the dim light. The house was hers now, or perhaps she was the house's, and she knew she would never leave. The library was silent now, its oppressive hum gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Clara stood in the center of the room, her breath shallow as she stared at the remnants of the mirror. The shards scattered across the floor reflected fractured pieces of the space around her. Twisted bookshelves, faded sigils, and faint glimmers of light that shouldn't exist. The farmhouse groaned, its walls settling with a weight that pressed against her chest. The ritual was over, or so she thought. Clara's hands trembled as she gazed at her reflection in one of the larger shards. The woman staring back was her, yet not her. The faint glow in her eyes, the ember-like flicker she had seen in the figure, lingered, a constant reminder of what she had unleashed. The sigil on the floor beneath her feet was no longer glowing, but its presence remained, burned into the wood like a scar. She traced its lines with her gaze, the patterns now etched into her memory. She understood its purpose now, not just to summon, but to bind. She felt the weight of the library's knowledge pressing against her mind, the whispered secrets of the books still echoing in her thoughts. They would never leave her. Clara knew what she had to do. She moved to the nearest shelf, her fingers brushing against the spines of the ancient, cryptic tomes. One by one, she removed them, her hands steady despite the fear gnawing at her core. She placed them in the center of the room, atop the faint sigil, arranging them as though closing a puzzle she never meant to solve. The farmhouse seemed to protest, the floorboards creaking beneath her and the walls groaning as if alive. The air grew colder, the faint whispers rising again, but Clara ignored them. She wouldn't stop now. From her uncle's journal, she remembered the final step, sealing the library. The books were the source, the conduit for the farmhouse's power. They had to be locked away, hidden from the world once more. Clara retrieved the heavy oak door that had concealed the library and pushed it closed. It resisted, the air thickening as though the house itself fought her. But she pressed on, her strength fueled by desperation. When the door finally clicked into place, the whispers ceased. The farmhouse seemed quieter now, its oppressive energy diminished. Yet Clara could still feel it, the faint hum beneath the silence, the way the air seemed to shift around her. She was no longer a guest here. She was part of it, tied to the house in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. Her reflection in the glass of the study's broken window confirmed what she feared. The faint glow in her eyes hadn't faded. It wasn't just the library that had been marked by the ritual. It was her. Clara spent the following days in solitude, cleaning the farmhouse and preparing to leave. Yet every step she took, every door she opened, reminded her of the truths she now carried. The farmhouse wasn't just a relic of her family's past. It was their curse, their burden, and now hers to bear. She thought often of her uncle, of his frantic notes and his final, desperate attempts to contain what he had unleashed. She understood now why he had disappeared. The farmhouse had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him, and just as it had claimed her. Before leaving, Clara returned to the study one last time. The false wall that had concealed the library was intact again, as though it had never been opened. She placed her hand against it, the wood cool beneath her palm. The library was sealed, but she could still feel its presence. It whispered to her in the back of her mind, a constant hum that would never truly fade. "This is my inheritance," she murmured, her voice heavy with resignation. She stepped away, her hand lingering for a moment before she turned and walked out of the farmhouse. The farmhouse disappeared in her rearview mirror as Clara drove away, the dirt road winding through the hills. But the weight of what she had uncovered remained with her, an unshakable shadow that followed her wherever she went. The glow in her eyes persisted, faint but undeniable. At night, she dreamed of the library, the books, the sigils, the mirror. and woke with the whispers echoing in her mind. She knew she couldn't escape it. The library, the farmhouse, the rituals, they were a part of her now. And though the library was sealed, Clara understood the truth. The knowledge she had uncovered could never be forgotten. The farmhouse had let her go, but only for now. One day, it would call her back, and when it did, she would answer.